He secretly installed cameras all over the house. Not to protect his family, but to frame his own pregnant wife. He thought no one would ever find out. But what he didn't know was that someone was already watching him. Stay with me, because the footage you're about to hear about didn't just destroy a marriage, it almost erased the truth entirely. The screen flickered in cold grayscale, the kind of security feed that made everything feel distant, unreal, like a memory you couldn't quite trust, and there she was, Emily Carter, 7 months pregnant, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, her voice barely audible as she whispered something no one could fully make out, then a sudden movement, a shift in balance. A moment that lasted less than 2 seconds but would be replayed millions of times across phones and screens, analyzed, judged, condemned, and in that brief, silent fragment, it looked like she had done something unforgivable, something deliberate, something that turned her from a quiet suburban wife into a headline that spread like wildfire across the country. Because by sunrise the next morning, more than 20 million people had already seen the clip, already formed their opinions, already decided who she was without ever hearing her speak. And the comments came fast, sharp, certain, calling her dangerous, unstable, a threat to her own child, while news anchors replayed the same angle again and again, each time slowing it down, zooming in, drawing conclusions from pixels and shadows, and somewhere behind all of that noise, behind the outrage and the certainty, there was a single detail no one questioned, the camera itself, perfectly positioned, perfectly clear, capturing exactly what it needed to capture and nothing more. As if it had been waiting for that moment long before it ever happened, but Emily didn't see any of that when the police knocked on her door. She didn't see the headlines or the millions of views or the strangers dissecting her life. She only saw confusion reflected in the glass of her living room window as she tried to piece together what they were accusing her of, because in her mind there was no clear memory of what the video showed, only fragments, gaps, a sense that something had been taken out of order. Like pages torn from a book she was still trying to read. And when they showed her the footage, when they pressed play and let those few seconds unfold in front of her eyes, she felt something colder than fear settle in her chest. Because she recognized herself, she recognized the room, the lighting, the quiet hum of the house she had lived in for 3 years. But the version of events playing out on that screen didn't match the one in her head, and that mismatch, small at first, almost invisible, was the crack that would eventually break everything open, though no one in that moment believed her when she said softly, almost to herself, "That's not what happened." And no one listening outside that room cared enough to ask why the camera had been there in the first place. By the time the sun set that same day, Emily Carter was no longer just a woman trying to understand what had happened inside her own home. She had become a symbol, a cautionary tale repeated across television screens and social media feeds, her name spoken with certainty by people who had never met her, her face frozen in that single frame that seemed to define everything. And standing just a few feet away from her in the living room, Daniel Carter understood exactly how powerful that image had become, because he did not raise his voice, he did not argue with the officers or the questions, he simply placed a steady hand on the back of a chair and spoke in a tone that sounded controlled, concerned, almost practiced, explaining that Emily had been under stress, that the pregnancy had been difficult, that he had been worried about her for weeks, and every word he chose felt carefully measured, like pieces placed on a board long before anyone realized the game was being played, while Emily stood there trying to find something solid to hold on to in a situation that kept shifting around her, because the more Daniel spoke, the more the story seemed to move away from her, as if her own voice no longer carried weight in a room filled with authority and assumptions. And when one of the officers asked if there were any prior incidents, Daniel hesitated just long enough to make the silence meaningful before answering that there had been moments where Emily seemed confused, moments where she could not recall things clearly, and that hesitation, that carefully timed pause, planted something deeper than accusation. It planted doubt, not just in the minds of the people in that room but slowly, quietly, inside Emily herself. Because she knew she had been tired, she knew there had been nights where sleep came in fragments, where thoughts blurred at the edges, but none of that explained what she was seeing now, none of that explained how a camera had captured a moment she could not fully remember, And as the officers began documenting everything, moving through the house with measured steps, noting the layout, the furniture, the small details that turned a home into a scene to be examined, Emily's eyes drifted toward the corner of the living room ceiling, a place she had looked at countless times without ever noticing anything unusual, and now she found herself staring at it longer than necessary, because something about that space felt different, not visibly altered, not obvious, but wrong in a way she could not explain, like a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to surface. And when she finally spoke again, her voice steadier than before, she did not repeat that the video was wrong, she did not argue or defend herself, she asked a single question instead, directed at no one in particular, and yet heavy enough to shift the air in the room. "Since when do we have cameras inside the house?" And for a brief second, just long enough to be missed by anyone not paying close attention, Daniel's expression tightened, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, but enough for something underneath his calm exterior to flicker into view before it disappeared again, replaced by the same composed concern he had been wearing all along, and that flicker, that almost imperceptible crack, was the first real sign that the story everyone believed might not be the story that actually happened. The room did not react immediately to Emily's question, but something shifted in the silence that followed, something subtle yet undeniable, like a thread being pulled loose from a carefully woven story, and Detective Robert Hayes felt it the moment he stepped through the front door less than 15 minutes later, his presence quiet but commanding, his eyes scanning the room not for emotion but for patterns, for inconsistencies, for the small details that most people overlooked when they were too busy reacting, because while everyone else had been focused on the video, Robert was already thinking about the angle, the clarity, the precision of that footage, and as he greeted his daughter with a brief nod rather than an embrace, it was not coldness that held him back, it was focus, the kind that came from years of experience where feelings had to wait until facts were uncovered, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying just enough weight to draw attention without demanding it, asking a question that sounded simple but landed with quiet force. "Who installed the cameras?" And for the first time since the officers had arrived, no one answered right away, because the assumption that cameras had always been there was beginning to feel less certain, and Daniel was the one who stepped forward again, offering an explanation that sounded reasonable on the surface, saying he had recently upgraded the home's security system for safety, for peace of mind, for the baby, and every word fit together cleanly, almost too cleanly, as if rehearsed in advance. But Robert did not respond to the explanation itself, he responded to the timing, to the way the answer arrived just a fraction too quickly, and without raising his voice or shifting his stance, he walked slowly across the living room, his gaze lifting toward the same corner Emily had been staring at moments before, and what he saw was not obvious to anyone else. Not a blinking light or an exposed lens, but a slight difference in the texture of the ceiling panel, a faint misalignment that suggested something had been placed there recently, something that did not belong when the house was first built, and that was enough to confirm what he had already begun to suspect, because real security systems were not installed quietly in isolated spots, they were documented, registered, connected to networks that could be traced. And yet no one had mentioned a provider, a contract, or even a basic control panel, which meant this was not a system designed for protection, it was a system designed for something else entirely. And as Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not to call anyone but to take a single photo of the ceiling, he spoke again, this time softer, almost to himself, but loud enough for Daniel to hear. "This feed did not come from a standard system." And that statement, simple as it was, carried more weight than any accusation, because it did not attack the story directly, it questioned the foundation beneath it, and for a brief moment, Daniel's composure tightened again, that same flicker of tension returning before he forced it back under control, while Emily stood in the center of the room, watching the exchange unfold like a scene she was no longer part of but somehow still trapped inside, her mind racing not with answers but with a growing realization that whatever had been captured on that camera was only a piece of something much larger, something constructed with intention, and for the first time since she had seen the footage, she felt a shift inside her, not certainty, not yet, but the faint return of something she thought she had lost, the belief that the truth, whatever it was, had not been erased completely, only hidden. Waiting for someone who knew where to look. Robert Hayes did not need to raise his voice or issue commands to take control of the situation, because control for him came from something quieter, something far more unsettling to anyone who had something to hide, and that was patience, the kind that allowed silence to stretch just long enough for cracks to appear on their own. And as the officers continued their routine, documenting and observing, Robert stepped slightly aside, his attention shifting from the physical space to something less visible, something that existed behind the walls and beyond the room, because if the camera was not part of a registered system, then the real story was not in the house at all, it was in the data, in the signal, in the path that footage had taken before it ever reached the outside world, and without asking for permission, without making a scene, he began tracing that path in his mind, reconstructing possibilities based on experience, because hidden cameras did not operate in isolation. They transmitted, they stored, they connected, and every connection left a trace no matter how carefully it was concealed, while across the room Daniel maintained his composure, answering questions, offering explanations, his tone steady, controlled, but now there was a new layer beneath it, something tighter, something less certain, because the narrative he had built depended on everyone accepting what they saw without asking how it came to be seen, and Robert was not the kind of man who accepted anything at face value, especially not something that looked too precise to be accidental, and as Emily watched her father move through the room, not touching anything, not disrupting the scene, she felt something shift again, this time stronger, more grounded, because for the first time since everything began, someone was not reacting to the image. Someone was questioning its origin, and that difference mattered more than she could fully explain, because it meant the story was not fixed, it was still unfolding, and as Robert finally turned back toward her, his expression unchanged but his eyes sharper, more focused, he asked her a question that cut through everything else. "Do you remember anything before the moment in the video?" And Emily hesitated, not because she did not want to answer, but because the answer was not simple, it was fragmented, scattered across impressions and sensations that did not quite align, and she closed her eyes for a brief second, searching through those fragments, trying to find something solid enough to hold on to, and what surfaced was not a clear memory but a feeling, a sense of disorientation, of something being slightly off, like walking into a room and forgetting why you were there, and when she opened her eyes again, her voice was quiet but steadier than before as she said, "I remember the room, I remember standing there, but it feels like something is missing, like there is a gap I cannot explain." And Robert nodded once, not in agreement but in recognition, because gaps were not weaknesses in a case, they were entry points, places where the truth had been altered or removed, and as he turned his attention briefly toward Daniel, that same calm expression still in place, he spoke again, this time directing the question outward, not just to the room but to the situation itself. "And who has access to that feed?" And the question hung there, heavier than any accusation, because it did not challenge what had happened, it challenged who controlled how it was seen, and in that moment, for the first time since the video had surfaced, the certainty that had filled the room began to thin, replaced by something far more dangerous for anyone relying on a single version of events, doubt. The question did not receive an immediate answer, and that silence stretched longer than any spoken denial could have, because access meant control, and control meant intent, and Robert Hayes understood that whoever controlled the feed controlled the narrative that had already spread beyond that house, and without waiting for a direct response, he stepped toward the nearest wall where a small panel should have existed if the system were legitimate, but there was nothing there. No interface, no visible hardware, nothing that would allow a homeowner to monitor their own security, which confirmed what he already suspected, this was not protection. This was surveillance designed to remain invisible, and as he pulled out his phone again, this time opening a diagnostic application used for signal tracing, his movements remained calm, almost routine, but his focus sharpened as the screen began detecting nearby wireless transmissions, filtering through networks, isolating anomalies, and within seconds there it was. A signal that did not match any registered provider, broadcasting on a narrow band frequency typically used for private feeds, encrypted but not invisible to someone who knew where to look, and as Robert followed that signal path, his expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a quiet confirmation that the truth was no longer hidden, only waiting to be revealed. While across the room Daniel adjusted his stance slightly, his arms folding for a moment before he forced them to relax again, as if even that small gesture might draw attention, because he could see what was happening now, not fully, not in detail, but enough to understand that the direction of the situation was changing, and Emily, standing just a few feet away, watched her father's phone with growing intensity, not because she understood the technical process unfolding on the screen, but because she could feel the shift in momentum. The subtle but undeniable movement away from accusation and toward something else, something closer to the truth, and when Robert finally spoke again, his voice carried the same calm tone, but now it held something firmer beneath it, something that did not ask for permission or approval. "This feed is not stored locally," he said, his eyes still on the screen. "It is being routed through an external server." And that single statement changed everything in the room, because it meant the footage had not just been captured, it had been transmitted, processed, possibly altered before anyone else ever saw it, and that possibility, once introduced, could not be undone. And as one of the officers stepped closer, asking where the server was located, Robert did not answer immediately. Instead he tapped the screen once more, tracing the signal path further, following it beyond the house, beyond the neighborhood, until it resolved into a location that was both precise and unexpected. And when he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes moved not to the officers, not to Emily, but directly to Daniel, and for the first time since entering the house, his voice carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "It is being routed through a private node registered under a name," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "A name that is not a company, not a security provider." And he paused just long enough for the meaning to settle before finishing the sentence. "It is registered to you." And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was charged, heavy, with the realization that the story everyone had believed was no longer holding together, and in that moment, the image that had defined Emily in the eyes of millions began to lose its certainty, replaced by something far more powerful, the possibility that it had never been the truth at all. For a moment no one moved, not the officers, not Emily, not even the air in the room seemed willing to shift, because the implication of what Robert had just said did not need to be explained, it was already understood, and Daniel was the first to react, not with anger or panic but with something far more controlled, a small exhale, a slight shake of his head, the kind of response designed to suggest disbelief rather than guilt. As if the idea itself were too unreasonable to take seriously, and when he finally spoke, his voice remained steady, measured, carefully composed. "That does not mean anything," he said, stepping forward just enough to re-enter the center of the conversation. "I set up the system, of course it would be under my name." And the explanation sounded logical on the surface, clean, simple, something that could easily be accepted by anyone not looking deeper. But Robert did not respond immediately, because this was not the moment to argue, this was the moment to let the truth build its own weight, and instead of challenging the statement directly, he shifted his focus back to the device in his hand, scrolling through the data, isolating timestamps, mapping the sequence of transmissions, and what he saw there was not consistent with a standard recording, not even consistent with a continuous feed. There were interruptions, gaps measured not in minutes but in seconds, subtle enough to go unnoticed by the untrained eye, but clear enough to someone who understood how digital footage should behave. And as he zoomed in on one particular segment, his finger paused over the screen before he turned it slightly, just enough for the nearest officer to see. "A normal feed does not skip like this," he said quietly, not accusing, not raising his tone, just stating a fact that carried more weight than any argument. "This has been processed." And that word, processed, landed differently than everything that had come before, because it introduced intention. It suggested that what they had all seen was not a direct reflection of reality but something that had been handled, adjusted, possibly reshaped before being released, and Emily felt that word settle inside her like a key turning in a lock, because it gave form to the feeling she had not been able to name, the sense that something was missing, something had been removed from the sequence of events she was now being judged for, and she looked at Daniel. Not with fear this time, not even with anger, but with a quiet, searching focus, as if she were seeing him from a distance for the first time, while Daniel's expression held steady for another second longer before that same flicker returned, sharper now, harder to contain, and one of the officers stepped closer, asking what exactly that meant, what kind of processing, and Robert answered without hesitation, his voice still calm but now precise, each word chosen with deliberate clarity. "It means the footage we saw is not complete," he said, lifting his gaze from the screen and letting it rest, once again, on Daniel. "An incomplete footage can change what a moment looks like." And the room absorbed that statement in silence, because it did not overturn the story yet, it did not prove anything on its own, but it weakened the certainty that had been built around that single clip, and certainty was the foundation Daniel had relied on, the one thing that kept the narrative intact, and as that foundation began to shift, even slightly, the structure above it started to feel less stable, less reliable, and Emily, standing in the center of it all, felt something return that she had not realized was gone until now, not just hope, but clarity, the understanding that whatever had been done, whatever had been shown to the world, it had not been the full truth. And if it was not the full truth, then it could be uncovered. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it was visible now in the way people stood, in the way questions were no longer directed only at Emily but began to circle outward, touching every assumption that had been made in the last 24 hours, and Daniel felt it just as clearly as everyone else, even if he refused to show it, because control had always been his advantage. The ability to stay composed while everything else moved around him, but control required a stable ground, and that ground was starting to give way, piece by piece, as Robert Hayes continued to examine the data with the same quiet precision that had already changed the direction of the entire situation, and without raising his voice, without even looking up at first, he spoke again, this time not as a question but as a sequence of observations. "The timestamp on the clip that went public is not aligned with the raw transmission log," he said, his finger moving across the screen, isolating a segment. "There is a delay of just under half a second between the audio channel and the visual frame." And while that detail might have sounded insignificant to anyone else, it landed differently in that room, because it was too specific to ignore, too technical to dismiss as opinion, and one of the officers leaned in slightly, asking what that meant in practical terms, and Robert answered without hesitation, his tone steady, factual. "It means the audio and the video were not captured at the exact same moment, which suggests they were processed separately before being combined." And that explanation carried a quiet finality, because it did not accuse, it demonstrated, it showed that what everyone had accepted as a single, continuous moment might actually be a constructed sequence, and Emily felt that realization settled deeper than anything else had so far, because it explained the disconnection she had been struggling to articulate, the reason why the image felt real and yet incomplete at the same time. And she closed her eyes briefly, not in distress but in focus, trying to align what she remembered with what had been shown, and for the first time, something new surfaced, not a full memory but a fragment, the sound of a voice just before the moment in the video. A tone she recognized but could not fully place, and when she opened her eyes again, her voice was quiet but certain. "There was someone speaking before that," she said, looking directly at Robert. "I remember hearing something, but it is not in the video." And that statement added another layer to the growing uncertainty, because it introduced something missing not just visually but audibly, and Robert nodded once, acknowledging the detail without overreacting, because missing elements were not anomalies to him, they were patterns, and as he returned his attention to the device, he adjusted the filter again, isolating a broader segment of the feed, not just the portion that had been released, but the surrounding data, the transmissions that came before and after, and within seconds, a new sequence appeared, one that had not been included in the public clip, one that extended beyond the moment everyone had already seen, and as he studied it, his expression remained controlled, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a confirmation that something critical had just been uncovered, and when he finally lifted his gaze, it moved once more to Daniel, not with accusation but with certainty, and he spoke a single sentence that changed the weight of everything in that room. "There is more footage than what was released." And that truth, simple and undeniable, did not just weaken the story that had been told, it exposed the possibility that the story itself had been chosen, edited, shaped to create a specific outcome, and in that moment, the question was no longer what happened, but why only part of it had been shown. The room seemed to hold its breath as Robert Hayes adjusted the angle of his phone and expanded the newly uncovered sequence, not rushing, not dramatizing the moment, because truth did not need urgency. It only needed to be seen clearly, and as the extended footage stabilized on the screen, the difference was immediate, not dramatic at first glance, not something that would shock an audience trained to look for obvious turning points, but something quieter, more precise, a continuation of the same moment that had been cut short in the version everyone else had seen, and Robert tilted the screen just enough for the nearest officer to observe without announcing what they were about to notice. Because discovery carried more weight when it was recognized rather than explained, and within seconds, the officer's posture shifted slightly, a subtle reaction that confirmed what Robert already knew. The sequence did not begin where the public clip began, it started earlier, several seconds earlier, and in those seconds, Emily was not acting, not moving with intent, she was turning, reacting to something outside the frame. Something that had been completely removed from the version that defined her in the eyes of millions, and that absence was no longer abstract, it was visible, measurable, undeniable. While across the room Daniel remained still, his expression controlled. But now there was a new layer beneath it, something more rigid, more deliberate, as if stillness itself had become a strategy. And Emily watched the screen with a growing intensity that bordered on disbelief. Because the moment she had been unable to reconcile in her own memory was now unfolding in a way that felt closer to what she remembered, not perfectly aligned, not fully restored, but no longer isolated, no longer reduced to a single, misleading frame, and when Robert finally spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was a quiet finality to it now, the kind that did not seek agreement, only acknowledgement. "The public clip starts at second 8, he said, his finger hovering over the timeline. "This begins at second 1. And that distinction, simple as it sounded, carried enormous weight, because it meant 7 seconds had been removed. 7 seconds that changed context, sequence, interpretation, and as one of the officers asked what occurred in those missing seconds, Robert did not answer immediately, instead he replayed the segment once, slowly, allowing the room to observe the details that had been hidden, the shift in Emily's posture, the direction of her gaze. The subtle indication that her attention had been drawn by something or someone not visible in the cropped frame, and then he paused it at a single point, a frame that would have gone unnoticed in real time, where a faint reflection appeared on the surface of a glass cabinet behind her, not clear, not defined, but enough to suggest the presence of another figure just outside the primary angle of the camera, and that detail, small and easily overlooked, changed the entire structure of the narrative, because it introduced a new variable, someone else, something else. A factor that had been deliberately excluded from the version presented to the world, and Robert let that realization settle before speaking again, his eyes lifting from the screen to rest briefly on Daniel. "This was not just recorded," he said quietly. "It was selected." And that word carried more weight than any accusation, because selection implied intent. It implied that what had been shown was not the whole truth, but the part of the truth that served a purpose, and as the silence returned, heavier now, more focused, the story that had once seemed complete began to unravel, not with noise or confrontation, but with the quiet, undeniable presence of what had been left out. The silence that followed Robert's last statement did not feel empty anymore, it felt charged, like a space waiting for something inevitable to surface. And this time it was not Robert who moved first, it was Emily, her eyes still fixed on the screen as if the answer she had been searching for was finally beginning to take shape in front of her, because the reflection in the glass, faint as it was, did not feel unfamiliar. It felt close, too close to ignore, and she took a slow step forward, her hand instinctively resting against her stomach as if grounding herself in the moment, her voice quiet but no longer uncertain. "Play it again," she said, not as a request but as a need, and Robert did not hesitate. He replayed the sequence, slower this time, frame by frame, allowing every detail to surface, every fraction of a second to be examined, and as the image unfolded once more, Emily's breathing shifted slightly, her focus narrowing, her mind no longer scattered but aligning, connecting fragments that had been disconnected before, and then she saw it, not clearly, not in full detail, but enough to recognize the pattern, the movement, the positioning of the figure just outside the primary frame, and her voice came again, steadier now, carrying something new beneath it, recognition. "That is not random," she said, her eyes still on the screen. "Someone was standing there." And that statement, simple as it was, shifted the weight of the entire room once again, because it confirmed what the reflection had only suggested, that the moment captured in the video had not been isolated, it had been influenced, shaped by a presence that had been deliberately removed from view, and one of the officers leaned in closer, asking if the figure could be identified, but Emily did not answer immediately, because identification required certainty, and certainty was still forming, still assembling itself from fragments and impressions, and Robert, watching both the screen and his daughter, recognized that process, the way memory returned not as a complete image but as pieces that needed to be placed in the right order. And he adjusted the playback again, isolating the audio channel this time, amplifying the portion that had been previously dismissed as background noise, and within seconds, something subtle emerged, not a clear sentence, not a direct statement, but a tone, a voice layered beneath the ambient sound, and as it played, low but present, Emily's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by someone paying attention, because recognition does not always come with words, sometimes it comes with stillness. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried no hesitation at all. "I know that voice," she said, and for the first time since the investigation had begun, her gaze shifted away from the screen and moved directly across the room, settling on Daniel, not with accusation, not yet, but with a clarity that had not been there before, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were aligning, forming a pattern that could not be ignored, and Daniel, standing in that same controlled posture, felt that shift just as clearly as everyone else, because recognition is difficult to argue against. It does not rely on interpretation, it relies on familiarity. And as the room absorbed the implication of Emily's words, the question that followed did not need to be spoken aloud, it was already present in every mind, if there had been someone else in that moment, someone whose presence had been removed. Then the story that had been built around that single clip was not just incomplete, it was deliberately constructed, and the person who constructed it was no longer hidden behind the footage. They were standing in the room. No one spoke immediately after Emily's words settled into the room, because recognition carries a different kind of weight, one that does not rely on explanation or proof in the moment, it simply exists, undeniable to the person who feels it, and difficult for everyone else to ignore, and Daniel understood that shift instantly, even if he refused to acknowledge it. Because the balance he had maintained since the beginning was no longer stable, it was tilting, slowly but steadily, and for the first time, his response did not come as smoothly as before. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before he spoke, and when he did, his voice remained controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now, something sharper, something less rehearsed. "You are guessing," he said, his gaze fixed on Emily, not aggressive, but firm, as if trying to anchor the situation back to certainty. "There is no clear face, no clear voice, you cannot identify anything from that." And the argument sounded reasonable, logical even, because uncertainty could always be dismissed when it was not fully formed. But Robert did not respond to the words themselves, he responded to the timing, to the need behind them, because denial that arrives too quickly often reveals more than silence ever could, and instead of countering Daniel directly, he shifted his focus back to the device in his hand, isolating the audio once more, adjusting the frequency range, filtering out ambient noise, and what remained was still faint, still incomplete, but clearer than before, enough to distinguish tone, cadence, the subtle patterns that make a voice recognizable even without full clarity. And as he played it again, just for a second, just enough for the room to hear, he spoke quietly, almost conversationally. "Recognition does not require a full sentence," he said, his eyes not leaving the screen. "It requires familiarity." And that statement reframed the entire situation, because it moved the discussion away from what could be proven immediately and toward what could be confirmed through process, through investigation, through time. And time was something Daniel no longer controlled, and Emily, standing there, felt that shift as clearly as anyone, because for the first time since everything began, the burden of proof was no longer resting entirely on her. It was moving, redistributing itself across the room, onto the data, onto the inconsistencies, onto the person who had introduced them in the first place. And as Robert continued to work, his movements steady, deliberate, he accessed a deeper layer of the feed, one that had not been part of the initial transmission. One that required direct retrieval from the source rather than the routed signal. And within moments, another segment appeared, shorter, less refined, but unmistakably raw, unprocessed, and he did not announce it immediately. He simply turned the screen slightly, allowing the nearest officer to see, and this time the reaction was more visible, a shift in posture, a tightening of focus, because what appeared in that segment was not just a continuation of the moment, it was a different angle, a secondary capture point that had not been part of the original clip. And in that angle, the frame extended just enough to reveal what had been hidden before. Not in full detail, not perfectly clear, but enough to confirm presence, enough to show movement that did not belong to Emily alone, and Robert finally lifted his gaze, not rushing, not forcing the moment, but allowing the evidence to speak first, and when he did speak, his voice carried a quiet certainty that cut through everything else. "This system was not designed for safety," he said, his eyes moving briefly to Daniel. "It was designed for control." And that word, control, settled into the room with a finality that could not be easily dismissed, because it explained everything that had happened so far, the selective footage, the altered timing, the missing context, all of it pointed in one direction, not toward confusion, not toward accident, but toward intention, and in that moment, the story that had once seemed complete was no longer holding together at all, it was unraveling, thread by thread, revealing the structure beneath it, and the person who had built it was running out of ways to keep it intact. The word control did not fade from the room, it lingered, pressing into every silence, reshaping every assumption that had existed just minutes before, and this time Daniel did not respond immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because the space he had relied on to shape the narrative was no longer his to command, it had shifted, redirected by evidence that did not require his permission to exist, and when he finally moved, it was subtle, a slight adjustment of his stance, a measured breath, as if recalibrating in real time, searching for a version of the story that could still hold. But Robert Hayes did not give that space back, because the moment had already passed, and instead of confronting Daniel directly, he turned his attention to the officers. Not as an accusation, but as a continuation of process, his voice steady, precise. "We need to secure the full data chain," he said, holding up his phone just enough to indicate the source without dramatizing it. "This feed is not standalone, it is part of a system that includes external storage and likely remote access." And that shift, from observation to procedure, carried authority that no one in the room questioned, because it moved the situation out of speculation and into action, and as one of the officers nodded, beginning to make the necessary calls, the structure of the case changed in that instant, no longer centered on a single clip, but on an entire network of data that could be traced, verified, reconstructed, and Emily felt that shift more deeply than anyone else, because for the first time, the narrative that had defined her was no longer fixed, it was being dismantled piece by piece, not through emotion, not through defense, but through fact, and she stood there. Quieter now, not because she was uncertain, but because she was no longer alone in carrying the weight of what had happened, and Robert, without looking at her, seemed to understand that, because his next movement was not toward the screen, not toward Daniel, but toward the doorway, where he paused just long enough to speak again, this time not to challenge, not to explain, but to define what came next. "Once the full feed is retrieved, we will see the sequence as it actually occurred," he said, and the simplicity of that statement carried a finality that no argument could interrupt. Because sequence is not opinion, it is order, it is cause and effect laid out in time, and anything that disrupts that sequence reveals itself when the full timeline is restored, and Daniel understood that as clearly as anyone in the room, because the version he had presented depended entirely on isolation, on a single moment. Removed from its context, and without that isolation, without that control, the structure he had built could not stand, and for the first time since the investigation began, his silence was no longer strategic, it was necessary, because anything he said now would exist within a framework he no longer controlled, and as the officers began coordinating the retrieval, their focus shifting from Emily to the system itself, the center of the room moved with them, away from accusation and toward evidence, and Emily watched that shift with a quiet intensity, her hand still resting against her stomach, her breathing steady, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was finally moving in the right direction, and in that moment, the story that had once seemed complete to the outside world was no longer the story being told inside that house, it was only the beginning of something much larger. Something that would not be defined by a single clip, but by the truth that existed before it and after it, waiting to be seen in full. The shift from speculation to process did not slow the room down, it sharpened it, every movement now purposeful, every question grounded in the understanding that the answer no longer depended on interpretation but on retrieval, and within minutes the first confirmations began to return, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet authority of systems responding exactly as expected. And Robert Hayes stood near the edge of the room, his attention divided between the incoming data and the people still adjusting to the reality unfolding around them, because this was the moment where narratives either collapsed or tried to rebuild themselves, and Daniel, for all his composure, was not immune to that pressure, even if he refused to show it openly, his silence now longer than before, his stillness more deliberate, as if any movement might reveal something he could no longer control, and Emily, watching from the center of it all, felt the difference in a way that went beyond logic. Because the weight that had been pressing down on her since the video first appeared was no longer fixed in place, it was shifting, redistributing, moving away from her and towards something external, something that could be examined, tested, proven, and as one of the officers stepped forward with an update, the room seemed to narrow slightly, focus tightening around a single point. "We have partial access to the external storage," he said, his voice steady but carrying the unmistakable note of significance. "There is a full sequence archived, not just the segment that was released." And that confirmation did not surprise Robert, but it solidified the direction of everything that had been building since he walked into the house, because it meant the missing context was not lost, it had been preserved, intentionally or otherwise, and he nodded once. Not in satisfaction but in acknowledgement, because retrieval was only the first step, interpretation would follow, and without delay he moved closer, positioning himself where he could view the incoming data directly, and as the extended sequence loaded, frame by frame, the difference between what had been shown and what actually existed became impossible to ignore, the timeline stretching beyond the isolated moment, revealing continuity where there had once been a cut, and Robert did not rush to explain it. He let the sequence play, allowing the room to observe the progression naturally, the way events unfolded when they were not interrupted, not rearranged, not reduced to a single point of impact, and Emily watched it with a stillness that bordered on disbelief, because the fragments she had struggled to piece together were now aligning in real time, the missing seconds no longer abstract but visible, audible. Part of a larger flow that made sense in a way the isolated clip never had. And as the sequence reached the moment that had been shown to the world, it did not stop there, it continued, extending beyond it, revealing what followed, the immediate aftermath that had never been included, and that continuation carried its own weight, because it provided context not just before but after, framing the moment within a complete sequence rather than a chosen fragment, and Robert finally spoke. His voice low but clear, cutting through the silence without disrupting it. "This is the full chain," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the room before settling once more. "Before, during, and after." And that distinction mattered more than anything else, because truth is not found in a single frame, it is found in sequence, in the uninterrupted flow of events, and as the room absorbed that reality, the story that had once seemed so certain began to dissolve completely, replaced not by a new narrative, but by the absence of one, the space where the truth would now have to stand on its own, without selection, without alteration, without control. The room did not erupt when the full sequence ended, it did not demand a reaction, because the truth rarely arrives with noise, it arrives with clarity, and clarity has a way of silencing everything else, and as the final frame settled on the screen, what remained was not a dramatic reversal, not a sudden revelation designed for shock, but something far more powerful. A complete and uninterrupted timeline that no longer depended on interpretation, because the missing seconds, the altered audio, the selective framing, all of it had been replaced by continuity, by sequence, by the simple reality of what actually occurred when no one was editing the moment to serve a purpose, and Robert Hayes did not speak immediately, because there was nothing left to prove in that instant. The evidence had already done its work, it had restored context, it had revealed presence, it had exposed control. And now it simply existed, undeniable and complete, and the officers standing nearby understood that. Just as clearly, their attention no longer divided, no longer uncertain, but directed, focused on what came next rather than what had been assumed before, while across the room Daniel Carter remained where he stood, but the stillness that had once been controlled now felt different, heavier, no longer a strategy but a consequence, because the structure he had relied on had not just weakened, it had dissolved entirely, leaving nothing in its place but the absence of the narrative he had constructed, and Emily, standing just a few feet away, did not move toward him, did not speak to him, because the need for confrontation had disappeared along with the illusion, and instead she stood quietly, her hand resting against her stomach, her breathing steady, not in relief but in recognition, because what had been taken from her was not just reputation or trust, it was certainty. The certainty of her own memory, her own reality, and now, piece by piece, that certainty had been returned. Not through argument, not through defense, but through truth, and Robert finally stepped forward, not toward Daniel, not toward the officers, but toward his daughter, stopping just short of her, his presence close enough to be felt without needing to be announced, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because